And for the most part, we're basically looking at, for ocular visual impairments, issues of acuity loss, issues of field loss, or the unique impact of ocular motor impairments, whether it's strabismus or amblyopia or something else, right? So we can kind of guess what's going on there. We really can't do that with CVI. And I want to really, critically reinforce that the medical or clinical documentation that we get about CVI doesn't tell us that much about functionally what we can expect. Pretty much, it just tells us the diagnosis. Yes, the child has CVI. No, the child doesn't have CVI. We may get some beautifully detailed information about what's happening in the brain. We may get a great MRI scan or a micro MRI or a CAT scan that tells us where the impact is in the brain, but we can't actually look at those documents and those reports and tell anything about what to expect from functional vision assessment or what the impact is on the child's visual functioning. So in that sense, we really rely on functional vision assessment and observation for our students with CVI. Of course, kids with CVI can have additional ocular visual impairments. And in my experience, the most common ones are some sort of ocular motor issue. I think that amblyopia is quite common in kids with CVI. And my suspicion as to why amblyopia in particular is quite common is that if you think about it, kids with CVI have strong, especially when they're early in childhood and early in the CVI range, kids in phase 1, have strong visual field preferences. If you have a strong right side visual field preference, you're probably tending to use your right side of vision and even your right eye more often and more frequently, more effectively than your left. And so over time in early childhood, as vision is just developing, that left eye might develop an amblyopia just as a result of that strong visual field preference. So if that's the case, of course, you want to treat it like amblyopia, go to an ophthalmologist, see if patching is recommended or anything like that. The other one that I get very frequently, and a frequently asked question I get about it, is what about optic nerve hypoplasia or optic nerve atrophy and CVI? I have heard from a couple of neuro-ophthalmologists and ophthalmologists that it's possible that a very large percent, if not even most kids with CVI have some degree of optic nerve hypoplasia or optic nerve atrophy, right? And that's just because the optic nerve is going to be weaker if the information coming through is weaker, and the actual, the amount of information getting through the optic nerve in early childhood development is going to be impacted if the brain is not able to process it as well. And there may be some concomitant conditions that cause CVI that also cause optic nerve atrophy or hypoplasia. So what can you do about that? Well, the definition of optic nerve atrophy and optic nerve hypoplasia is very vague. And just having that diagnosis does not tell us a lot about how severe the ONA or the ONH is. It's been suggested in the last several years in the field of ophthalmology and neuro-ophthalmology that we have some sort of a rating scale for those conditions, almost like we do for ROP, right? If we had like a optic nerve hypoplasia stage 1, or stage 4 would be very severe. We don't have something like that. And so just knowing that they have that diagnosis doesn't tell us too much, and we should be a little bit cautious of prioritizing that diagnosis over CVI, which we can tell pretty well from functional observation and assessment, which we're going to dig into today and in the following sessions. Okay, so that's a big FAQ. If you guys have follow-up questions about that, which often people do, feel free to reach out to me. I can help and provide some language around communicating that issue to people. In order to suspect and diagnose CVI, it truly is a functional diagnosis. There's some diagnostic criteria that can be, suspected from an MRI, like enlarged ventricles in the brain is a sign of anoxic brain injury, could be a sign of CVI, but not always. Basically, it's a functional diagnosis. There must be these 3 criteria. Some history of brain injury or malformation, and we'll look at some of the more common causes. There must be a clinical or medical eye exam, and the reason that there must be one is that we have to rule out that what we're observing cannot be explained by an ocular condition, because there are some ocular conditions that you may see some overlap in the kinds of behaviors that you see in CVI. However, there is a presence of unique visual characteristics and behaviors that really is specific to CVI and cannot be explained by another ocular condition in full. Most of the day today, what we're going to do in the next hour or so is go through these characteristics in depth, talk about observing them, talk about what they look like on an earlier side as opposed to on a later side on the CVI range. So what they look like on this range of visual functioning. Here is just a short list of medical history that is significant for CVI, and the top two are sort of thought to be the most common causes of CVI, especially in early childhood, HIE and PVL. If there's a sign language interpreter along with me while I'm presenting, I love watching them fingerspell these words because it took a while for me to remember how to even say them properly. But hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy or paraventricular leukomalacia. And both of these are high risk events for kids who are low birth weight and early preterm birth. I'm talking 21 weeks to 27, 28 weeks premature. Both involve lack of oxygen to the brain, right? Lack of oxygen or too much oxygen to the brain, and can cause deterioration of white matter in the brain and can result in development of CVI and some other issues too. Seizure disorders can definitely be significant history for CVI. Stroke, I don't need to go through all of these, but just to emphasize, trauma and traumatic brain injury can occur at any stage in life, and asphyxia or even near drowning events that can cause CVI at any age, and we should still expect progress at any age in visual functioning with the right supports. I think we need a lot more research on structural abnormalities and metabolic disorders, as well as chromosomal disorders and genetic mutations that cause CVI. I think we're just really in the infancy of explaining and correlating some of these conditions to CVI. And I'll share a couple of examples with you as we go. I want to make sure that everyone understands that prematurity is not a cause of CVI. It's those events that can occur around premature birth, especially the first two up there, HIE and PVL, that can cause CVI. And cerebral palsy is not a cause, but rather it's an associated condition, because whatever caused the CP, like a stroke perinatally or after birth, whatever caused the CVI could also have caused CP. Okay, so it's good to be aware of these medical histories because it is the first step in aligning a diagnosis. So frequently asked questions, these are probably the most frequently asked questions that I get about CVI from families as well as from professionals. The clinical eye report results were normal or unable to test, but I know that the child's visual functioning is not typical. First thing I want to say is if you ever see unable to test on a vision report, that is a nonsensical term. No child is unable to test. Unable to test just means I don't know how to test this child. Go find somebody who does. So you should never accept unable to test as an answer. Instead, you should ask yourself, does this clinical vision specialist, whatever their role is, ophthalmologist, optometrist, do they recognize and diagnose CVI? Don't assume that they do. Ophthalmologists and optometrists are skilled and studied and certified in understanding and looking at structural issues in the eye. They don't necessarily have the background in neurological visual processing, and they may not have the tools or even the understanding of diagnosis to recognize or diagnose CVI. So save families the time by recommending to families that when they make an appointment, they ask before going in, they ask on the phone when making the appointment, does this person recognize or diagnose CVI? If not, go to someone who does. I'm sure that between this wide community, you can find people in your area that do have expertise in this, or at least are able to diagnose it. It could be a neuro-ophthalmologist, but it doesn't have to be. And also don't assume that all neuro-ophthalmologists can diagnose CVI. Often neuro-ophthalmologists are trained in diagnosing neurological visual processing disorders like dyslexia, synesthesia, depth perception issues, some of these other ones, prosopagnosia, and things like that. So again, you still want to ask that same question. And most importantly, follow up clinical assessment with functional vision assessment. Clinical assessment, like I said, doesn't give us that much useful information about functioning. We really need functional assessment for that. So what if the functional vision assessment does not address CVI? And this is a tricky area, one that I'm sure that many of you have come up against and have advocated for and tried to explain to folks. The way I think about explaining it is the same as the questions that we would ask a clinical professional. Does this TVI or low vision specialist who's doing the FVA have training in CVI and appropriate considerations for FVA for kids with CVI? Don't assume that they do. And if you're a TVI who doesn't quite yet feel comfortable assessing these students with CVI, it's okay to say, I'm not quite there yet. I need support in doing this. I need more training. I need mentorship or coaching, or I want to do a co-assessment with someone else. It doesn't make you a bad TVI. It just means that you haven't had the training specifically in this area, or you haven't had necessarily the practice with it. And I really like to encourage TVIs in particular to feel comfortable with saying that. You know, it does not make you a bad TVI. It just means that you need more support and coaching and maybe some collaborative assessment before you feel totally comfortable doing this on your own. It took me that time too. You know, for the first several years I was a TVI, I was not comfortable in reliably doing CVI assessment. But you can get there if you're willing to, you know, to ask for the support. What constitutes appropriate assessment, though? And this is a major area of debate in our field, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. Appropriate, of course, is the term that IDEA uses. So what is appropriate assessment? You're not allowed to, you know, I think pretty much in most states and districts, you can't really say that a child must use, or, you know, that a professional working with a child must use a specific assessment tool. So you can't necessarily demand that the child get a CVI range assessment, because that's a specific assessment tool. But you can say that the child must be assessed based on the unique considerations and unique impact of their specific condition, which is CVI, on their visual functioning. So doing a standard FVA with tools that are, you know, that are developed and geared towards students with ocular visual impairments and looks at ocular visual behaviors and visual functions like tracking, scanning, contrast sensitivity, stuff like that, it's not going to be appropriate because it's not actually an acuity, right? It's not actually relevant to CVI. It doesn't mean you can't assess those things too, but you must assess the unique impacts of CVI, whatever you understand those to be, right? So what we're doing today and in this series is trying to get some shared understanding and some thought process around what are those appropriate considerations? What are the unique behaviors? What's the unique impact? And what are unique practices to look at those behaviors and impact? So I think it's important that we do recognize that CVI is different from ocular conditions, so it needs a different type of assessment that looks at those unique differences, those unique considerations. Okay. So to clarify, anyone who has training and reliability in administering the CVI range can administer it. Doesn't have to be a TVI, but you cannot call it an FVA unless you're a TVI or a certified vision service provider. I've heard that it varies from state to state as to whether an O&M instructor or a CVRT, certified vision rehabilitation therapist, can administer an FVA. Does anybody know in Maryland, if you're an O&M or a CVRT, can you do a functional vision assessment? You want to just type that in the chat box if you have a good answer as to that? It'd be good to just clarify. I've heard some differences from state to state, which is interesting. But I want to emphasize this point because it is useful for other team members, including special ed teachers or other related service providers, to understand the assessment process and maybe even to use it as part of their assessments. I know a lot of occupational therapists who utilize CVI range assessment to support their OT evaluations. That doesn't make it an FVA, right? An OT can't do an FVA, but it is helpful to make their own assessments more functional and more student-centered. So why is it so important to identify and assess CVI, and what makes it so unique from other conditions? CVI, unlike ocular visual impairments, involves specific interventions that actually are intended to improve visual functioning or visual processing. So if you think about it and think about the expanded core curriculum and compensatory skills in the expanded core curriculum, students with ocular visual impairments that are either static, stable, or progressive, we're not trying to improve their vision. We're trying to teach them compensatory skills to get around the fact that they have a visual impairment and to succeed and be independent in spite of their visual impairment, right? With CVI, we're not doing that. We're actually trying to teach them to use their vision in a more efficient and functional way. And we're actually teaching them to improve their vision. So it's not that we are necessarily, we're actually teaching them how to use their vision to learn, right? I see Christina said in West Virginia, you're a TVI and you can do a CVI FVA if that makes sense, but relate it to the 10 characteristics of CVI. That's great. Yeah, that's really helpful. Yep, so you don't have to use a specific protocol, but you do, in order to be appropriate, you have to at least address the unique impact of CVI. It has to be based on assessment, the interventions that we're doing, and the reason that we need it to be based so strongly in assessment is that there are different approaches that we're using to support intervention and progress depending on where the student falls on this range of visual functioning, level of severity of visual functioning, from most severe towards closest to typical vision. And again, intervention has to be a team effort. We're talking about making neurological progress here. You cannot make neurological progress in a 2x30 TVI session, right? 2 times a week for 30 minutes. That's not enough practice for the brain to actually make the long-term improvement. And so instead, we really need everyone on the team to be on board so that we're getting this type of intervention embedded throughout the day and integrated into everyone's activities. One thing I like to tell other related service providers like PTs and OTs and speech pathologists and teachers too, we're not trying to get in the way of what you're doing or tell you that you need to do something different. Your goals are important too, right? A PT's goals are very important for a student, but they need to recognize that vision impacts their goals too. And that if they want to be able to meet their goals in a holistic way, they do need to understand and embrace these approaches towards adapting for the child's specific visual needs. So everyone's got to get on board, and everyone does play a role. Very often, the TVI or the vision service provider plays the role of team leader in sort of, bringing everyone together and rallying the troops around what holistic and comprehensive intervention looks like. Everything that I just said in the last 25 minutes is all on this 2-page fact sheet. So essentially, I just got tired of typing out the same answers for frequently asked questions. So I started cutting and pasting them into a fact sheet. And I made a 2-page fact sheet that answers some of the stuff for you. Please feel free to use this however, anything that I share with you, feel free to use it however may be helpful to you. The fact sheet has 2 pages. The first page just kind of breaks down the definitions, right? What it is, how is it different from ocular visual impairments, how is it diagnosed, what are the 10 characteristics, what are the 3 phases, unique approaches to each phase. And then the back side is some of these other frequently asked questions about who can diagnose it. What do I do if the eye exam said normal? What do I do if the FVA didn't address it? And then clarifying some terms, which we will talk about in a few minutes. And then there are also additional resources, links to resources that I found helpful for a variety of different topics. Susie, I think that Ruth Ann has the copy of this to share with everybody, either after or during presentation. So you're more than welcome to have this, do as you like with it. And feel free to take this wording and make it your own, copy and paste it right into your functional vision assessment if it's useful for you. Okay. So let's talk about what's happening in the brain. I think in order to understand the characteristics, we need to have at least a basic understanding of what's happening in the brain. Like I said, with an ocular visual impairment, we can put on goggles, right? We can put on adapted goggles. We could even watch a YouTube video of what it might look like to have glaucoma. We can't do that for CVI. So we can get an understanding of basically what's happening by understanding the visual processing centers in the brain. In the brain, in the visual cortex, which is in the back of the brain, remember, brain development in early childhood goes from back to front. So earlier in life, your back of your brain is actually more formed, and then neurological progress and synaptic pruning and brain development, it goes from back to front, which is why your frontal lobe, which controls things like your limbic system, which controls things like problem solving and reasoning and logic. That's why teenagers are not very good at those things, because their frontal lobe is not fully formed. So if anybody has a teenager at home or works with teenagers, they tend to not be good at decision making or logic or reasoning because literally they're not neurologically capable of making good decisions. So don't tell them that, because then they'll use it as an excuse. All right, so in the back of the brain, in your visual processing center, there are two primary streams of visual processing. Those are, you can almost think of them like roads or highways through which information goes. Input comes in through the eyes, it immediately simultaneously goes back into your visual processing center, and these two streams or highways process that information and make sense of it simultaneously. They are the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. And the dorsal stream gives you kind of rough information about kind of where things are, but not what they are. If you're using your dorsal stream, you get a lot of information about movement, about form, about lighting, and about color too. You don't get any information from your dorsal stream about acuity or detail, okay? And so if you're just using your dorsal stream, you tend not to be able to identify things at a distance. Instead, you bump up, you identify things by bumping into them. Your ventral stream is what gives you information about what you're looking at. So your ventral stream gives you information about detail, and your ventral stream also connects to your other cognitive processing centers to be able to start to categorize and classify what it is that you're seeing. So you can think of the ventral stream almost as the Google image bank of your brain. When an image comes in, your ventral stream figures out where to put it next to other images that are similar to it. If you see a type of dog that you've never seen before, you think, wow, that's a funny looking dog, but you immediately have figured out that's a dog because your brain has seen this new thing, this novel thing, and it's searched very quickly in the Google Imaging Processing Center, and it's put it next to other dogs that are in that category. So you can probably already tell, if you know a bit about CVI, what's happening here on a level of progress from phase 1, or sort of most severe impact of CVI, all the way up towards typical visual functioning. Kids with CVI tend to start with stronger dorsal streams. Kids really early in phase 1 maybe even only have slight use of their dorsal stream. As they make progress, they are strengthening their dorsal stream, and then somewhere in the middle there, they're starting to get some emerging ventral stream use. And then as they go on into phase 3, it's all about strengthening their ventral stream and making sense of what it is that they're looking at. So here's like a rough diagram of it. You can kind of, piece the two together, but basically, you have constant processing of information through dorsal and ventral. Ventral gives more about object processing, and dorsal gives more about spatial processing. again, you can't really do a simulation or put on goggles for CVI, but here's one that I've come up with that I like to use because it's an easy one to replicate in a school environment and to give people an idea of what this child might be experiencing. So take, I have like a mug that's full of pens. If you notice the ones that I'm holding up, they're all kind of dull colors, right? There's gray tones or black or kind of clear. There's not really much that we can, not really much that stands out there. So if I'm holding this up and I'm looking about 3, 4 inches, even 6 inches to the left of it, I'm not looking at it. I'm looking straight ahead and it's in my right visual field. I can see that it's there. I can see the shape, the form. I can see that it's sort of these dull color tones. It doesn't really stand out. I can't really make sense of it. This mug has writing on it. I can't read the writing if I'm not looking at it, right? The writing looks blurred to me and I can see this sort of blurred complex pattern because I'm not looking at it. If I try to, let's say I really want to get this pen. Here's a pen that I really want to get. If I am not looking right at it, I can't find that pen. I got the wrong one, right? So my look and my reach is not very well coordinated. I couldn't get the target that I was looking for. However, if I put something that's bright color, very saturated, I put that in this mug, okay? And still I'm not looking at it, I can go right to it and I got it. And why? Because in your dorsal stream, when you're not using eye to object contact and accessing detail and your ventral stream, using your dorsal stream alone, you get information about bright saturated colors. This makes a lot of sense with what we know about kids with CVI, right? The other thing is if you shine a light on something in here, I can also really see that light. So actually, if I shine a light here, if I had like 3 hands, I could do both things. But if I shine a light on this pen, I could actually find the pen and I could probably reach and pick it up even though it isn't a bright color. So the light really helps in my dorsal stream. The color really helps in my dorsal stream. And the reduced clutter also helps. If I take out all of these other pens and there's only one there, okay, no problem, I got it. All of these things are going to connect to CVI characteristics as we understand them, right? So that's a very rough simulation of what it looks like to be using your dorsal stream. And if you think about your students with CVI who don't make direct visual fixation, who don't establish eye to object contact, and who kind of seem to be looking past or through things rather than right at them, imagine going through the world with that type of visual experience, with only the type of information that we get when we're using our peripheral vision, right? I want to just clarify that this is not an exact simulation. Dorsal and ventral aren't exactly related to peripheral versus central vision. That's just a simulation that gives us a rough idea of what the world might look like if we were only using our dorsal vision. Similar to what the world looks like only through our peripheral fields. Blurred information, bright colors, lighting, form, but not a lot about detail. You can do the same type of simulation with your phone, and this one is useful for simulating access to assistive technology and AAC for kids with CVI, because try on your own phone, what can you do on your own phone if you're not looking right at it? If you're looking to the left of it or looking above it or to the right of it, can you open your phone, right? Do you have the motor planning to get the password on your phone? You might. If you do, once you've opened it, you've got a very busy screen, right? I have all of these apps on my phone. Some are bright, some are dull. Which ones can I access independently if I don't remember where they are? Well, on an iPhone, the message app is bright green, and so it really pops out. So, okay, maybe I can get that. The camera app is like a gray tone. It doesn't really stand out, and I have more trouble finding it. So, one of the things that I also like to say to folks, if you're not really sure what way your student is accessing information or how they might make sense of this type of simulation, try positioning your head and looking at things the way that you observe them to look at things, okay? If they turn their head a little this way and they do that, but they don't look right at it, try doing that yourself and see what it looks like to look at things using that unique sort of perspective. So again, not an exact simulation, but it gives you a rough idea. And I found that these types of very easy to replicate simulations are helpful for educational teams. And it turns on some light bulbs of, oh, that's what's going on there. And that's why it's hard for the child to see something without bright color, movement, or light, or reduced complexity. This has been described as like looking through a kaleidoscope. And I got this quote from Dr. Roman, but I believe that she had said that it was from a teenager who had CVI from a traumatic brain injury and had a memory of what it was like to have typical vision. And he said that having CVI going through the world was like looking through a kaleidoscope. So if you imagine looking through a kaleidoscope, the amount of information that you get from what you're looking at depends on the complexity of the array, right? If you're looking at a very busy preschool classroom with lots of artwork on the walls and toys and books and stuff, it's going to be really hard to figure out what you're seeing or pick out any individual target. But if you're looking at a plain colored wall, white or black, with a bright red ball in front of it and nothing else around it, then even through a kaleidoscope, you might actually be able to figure out what it is, and you might be able to go and find it and pick it up. So kaleidoscope analogy gives us a good idea about how impactful complexity is, as well as light. These are the 10 visual characteristics, and we're going to review them. We're going to kind of do like a little bit of a whirlwind tour of these with the understanding that this is probably review for most of you guys. So I want to emphasize some new information or different ways of thinking about these characteristics rather than, you know, the 3-hour version. We could really spend a lot of time on every individual one. I want to just first cover in the next 10 minutes, maybe some current research and updates. Some of this, again, familiar to you, maybe some of it not. Trying to get a better idea as we go and, you know, sort of constantly getting a better idea of what the current status of needs are in the field for professionals and for families. For families, what I'm seeing across the country is that families still need support, especially families need information. And I think families most of all need clarity of information, because there's a lot of information out there. If you Google CVI or if you really want to give yourself a headache, look up CVI on Pinterest or on YouTube, and you'll find that there's tons of information, but it's hard to figure out what's good and what's bad, right? And there's not a lot of quality control necessarily, and there's not a lot of organized way of looking at this. Families need community too, and as I'll show you, I think families have better access to CVI community than professionals do currently. Professionals need professional development, right? I think even if you've had it, even if this is a refresher for you, we need ongoing professional development. I need ongoing professional development to keep up on things. I certainly don't know everything about CVI at all, and I'm constantly learning something new from different people. I know you have Diane Sheline presenting on this series as well, and her expertise and her ideas, and I think her creativity of her practice gives you a whole different, unique kind of area of support and innovation than what I could provide. So I think we need to support each other with professional development as a community. We need communities of practice. I don't think that we really have solid CVI specific communities of practice. I think AER and your Maryland AER, obviously, our national AER, AER could be a really good venue for these types of communities of practice. But I think that we still need to separate them out and to say, you know, we have vision communities, but we don't necessarily have CVI specific communities of practice to share resources, to share ideas, to share examples of adaptations, and also to coach and collaborate with each other on assessment so that we can all get better at it. We have research. Mostly what we have in research is what's called promising practices. So we want to be careful not to say that we have evidence-based practices. We have very few evidence-based practices in the field of vision in general, because we're a low incidence field. So we really only have evidence-based practices in a couple of areas, like Braille instruction. If you remember those old ABC Braille studies, ongoing long-term studies about, what the best practices for teaching Braille are. Those are evidence-based because they were replicated with hundreds of students over years. We don't necessarily have that in many other areas of the field. What we do have is we have a good idea of what works, and we desperately need more research to back that up, so that it's not just, hey, I think this is a good idea. It's no, this is research-based practice. We also have examples of advocacy. We have our organizations like AER, et cetera. We do have some examples of legislation pending, which is interesting. I'll show you that in a second. Like I said, our understanding is constantly evolving. We need to be sort of collaborating across disciplines even. We need to be pairing education with clinical research from neurology and ophthalmology. And we need to be establishing solid practices around assessment and that show that assessment actually works and is reliable and valid. There are many more parent organizations getting involved in the CVI field. Specifically, I've noted in the past couple of years, some etiology-specific organizations getting involved, like CDKL5. Maybe some of you have had a student with CDKL5 or cytomegalovirus. CDKL5 used to be very commonly misdiagnosed as Rett syndrome because it basically has all of the same symptoms as Rett syndrome, but it's a different condition. It's a related condition, but it's pretty different. And CDKL5 affects male and female kids, and not, whereas Rett syndrome tends to be just females. CDKL5 Foundation, International Foundation, has recently gotten super involved in CVI research. And that's because one of the people who leads that organization is a parent of a child with CVI. So this is how this works. Again, advocacy on a local, state, national, regional level. And I'll show you an example in a second. New books, if you haven't seen yet, the second edition of Dr. Roman's book on approach to assessment intervention. If you don't have it and you're using the old book, then you're out of date. The old book, the assessment isn't changed, but the protocol for scoring the assessment is updated significantly, and the understanding of the characteristics is updated significantly. So it's either going to be important to have a copy or to know somebody who does, or to at least have the training on what the updates are, because we know a lot more about CVI than we did in 2007. There's also an advanced principles book that each chapter kind of looks in at specific subtopics like O&M and CVI, social skills and CVI, and so on, literacy and CVI, communication and CVI. Just a month ago or so, Dr. Roman and Matt Tejan, who's a really stellar TVI out in Connecticut, developed a new assessment tool, which is basically a learning media assessment or a learning media profile for a child with CVI, looking at balancing sensory complexity and sensory input. So if you haven't seen that, very much worth checking out. This was a pretty cool example that I found recently. This was as of March 2020. And there hasn't been an update since then presumably because COVID happened. But in the Louisiana Senate, there's actually a bill that is pending right now for establishing a commission within the Department of Health and Early Intervention for identifying risk factors for CVI. This is exciting. I don't know of anything else like this around the country, but if this happens, I think that this could be replicated in other states. And it basically treats, if you read the full document, it treats CVI as a healthcare crisis, a major issue facing early intervention. And it accepts that in order to address that issue, you need a whole separate commission for increasing identification and referral for these kids. I'm excited about this, and I feel like it's worth paying attention to because this would be very helpful if we could replicate this across the country. The only other thing I'd add about that is that this kind of thing happens as a result of parents. This does not happen as a result of educators. Educators can provide information and explanation to support this kind of advocacy, but pretty much without exception, these types of things happen because parent advocacy groups get behind them. So I'm sure that that's what's happening in Louisiana. But it's good to know about and pay attention to, and kind of rally your parent groups to get behind. Hey, just a couple more general updates. I'm going to switch over and spend the rest of the time on characteristics. The Perkins CVI work groups, if any of you attended the Perkins CVI Symposium in 2019, what followed as a result of those symposium sessions was a series of work groups, and they split them up into family advocacy, family and legal, personnel prep, so like TVI programs, O&M programs, and so on, educational assessment, and then the fourth one was medical and diagnostic. And the point of these work groups is to develop guides, basically, or guidelines for what constitutes best practice in each of these areas. There's nothing published or available yet, but hopefully in the next 6 months to a year, you're going to have some documents that support best practices in each of these 4 areas. So look out for that. Hopefully it'll be a good resource once it's available. If you haven't heard of it, Perkins also offers a CVI range endorsement. I just wanted to clarify here what it is and what it isn't. What it is it is a measure of someone's reliability in scoring the CVI range assessment. It is not a measure of how good of a professional you are or how well you're able to implement interventions. It's just about your ability to reliably score the CVI range. I think it's very valuable, and I have the range endorsement. I think it was a learning experience and a really good thing for me just professionally in terms of, kind of narrowing in on my skill set and feeling more confident with it. But I want to be very clear that it cannot be used as a like a demand that a TVI who works with a student must have this, because it's really just a measure of your ability to reliably score an assessment. So it's a great thing. I highly encourage you to pursue it if you're interested, but don't feel like if you don't have it, that means that you're not a competent TVI and you don't know how to work with kids with CVI. Last thing I want to clarify here is the difference between cerebral and cortical. This is probably the most ongoing, area of debate in our whole field around CVI, and everyone has different opinions about it. The way that I would explain it is that cortical is a specific condition that is characterized by specific visual behaviors, the 10 characteristics, whereas cerebral is an umbrella category of neurological visual impairments. Cortical is one of those conditions. So cortical is a form of cerebral visual impairment, but cerebral visual impairment also includes other conditions, including synesthesia, prosopagnosia or face blindness, some other forms of neurological visual processing disorders that cause depth perception issues or recognition issues. Even dyslexia is considered to be a cerebral visual impairment. And the reason why I think it's important to clarify those terms and to be clear about when we're using which one is that if you think about it, those conditions that I just named under cerebral, they wouldn't all be treated by a vision specialist. Many of those conditions would be treated by a reading specialist or a learning disabilities specialist. So cortical, we are sort of accepting is a visual processing issue that can be effectively supported by a vision specialist and is marked or, is characterized by these specific behaviors. Okay, so I'm happy to answer any more questions about those things. I just want to skim through this very quickly because I want to get to the point, but just to note that there are some new products that APH has. There are some developing communities of practice, and I would encourage you guys to form your own. I want to hear from you guys, even afterwards, if anybody wants to reach out to me. I'd love to hear what you're working on in Maryland and learn from it and support it any way I can. Just some more resources for you. These are all at the end of the presentation too. So these are just family resources to share with families that you're working with. And if you haven't seen it, Pediatric Cortical Visual Impairment Society, PCVIS. It's also, I'll type it in the chat box, pcvis.vision. Their website is relatively new and is very comprehensive in the information that it provides for families and professionals. Really good resources there. Okay, so let's dig into CVI characteristics and phases. This is going to be like the whirlwind tour, focusing in on the most important updates to these and just making sure we have a solid overview of these. Because when we do our next session in December, we're going to talk about assessment and using characteristics to assess students. When we look at each of these 10 characteristics, what we're actually talking about is how each characteristic impacts the child's visual functioning or their ability to use their vision to get information throughout the day. Just like any other functional vision assessment, we're looking at visual functioning across activities, across environments, across times of day, and across days of the week. So as much observation as you can get about this is going to be helpful. The characteristics affect vision differently as visual and functioning improves along the range, right? And that's because of this dorsal ventral stream issue. To what extent is the child using each of those visual streams? So color preference is always going to be a characteristic, whether a child is in phase 1 or is in phase 3, but it looks different depending on where the child is. There is the range is 0 to 10. But there's no such thing as 0 because there's no such thing as a child with CVI who has no visual skills or behaviors. And there's no such thing as 10 because you never fully resolve CVI. But I have seen kids go from 1 to 7, 8. I've seen only a couple kids who I would really say I'm confident are at like the 9 level. But I've seen plenty of kids go from phase 1 to phase 3 in a period of, 5-6 years. There's no prognosis that you can give or expected outcome or amount of time it takes, but you should see steady progress. You should see the progress slow and become more subtle as they get on into phase 3. Okay, so let's talk about each characteristic, and we're looking at what it looks like on an earlier side and what it looks like more like in phase 3 or closer to typical vision. Okay, the first one is color preference. Kids with CVI, like we talked about the dorsal stream, tend to be able to see bright, saturated colors. Usually red and yellow are good go-to colors for kids in phase 1. A child earlier on the range may only see things that are a solid color, whereas a child later in the range benefits from color to be able to highlight or anchor their visual attention. So highlighting important information. And color is almost always the first go-to adaptation for kids with CVI, whether it is a curriculum adaptation or an O&M landmark or an adaptation to a communication system. Usually the first go-to thing to try. Interesting information is that, like we said, using your dorsal stream alone, you can get information on color, but you don't even need a visual cortex to see the color red. Your eyes and the frontal part of your brain actually processes the color red without it even going into your visual cortex. My guess as to why that is true, it must be an evolutional thing, right? If you think about the color red in nature, it's usually something that we should avoid, something you shouldn't touch or eat or mess with. And so, through evolution, our brains have learned to process red without it even going into our deeper visual processes. So examples here, right? You have kids on the earlier side who are only looking at solid colored objects, bright colors, neons, purple, yellow, orange. Can't look at objects that have multiple colors. Right, that's why toys like Elmo are, tend to be highly motivating and encouraging, bright color, but also not a lot of detail, not a lot of multiple colors. Slinkies as well, right? Things like that. So that's pretty easy. As the child goes on and improves their vision over time, the use of color is still there, but it becomes more of a functional adaptation to integrate their use of vision throughout the day. So this is a speech pathologist showing a student with CVI her calendar system. She's looking at this very simple array of communication symbols, or the APH tangible symbols. We're using the color red there at the rectangle on the left side of the board to anchor her attention to that box where she's going to put her communication symbol. And that's what we're doing now. So speech is now, we're moving it over, and the red color anchors attention to that space on the board. This was a really interesting one that I liked a lot, where there was a student with CVI who felt really disoriented in a busy classroom and would get stressed because he couldn't figure out where he was in relation to the door, right? So rather than have a bright red door, which is just overkill, you don't need to paint the door red or have like red tape around the entire door. Instead, we just put a little bit of this red electrical tape around the light switch to the left of the door. And when the child was sort of doing this panicked scanning, trying to figure out where he was, he would find that bright red anchor at the door, 4, 5, 6 feet away, and it would help him orient in space. So same principle. Here's a more functional version on a book on the bottom left side. Remember the book Brown Bear, Brown Bear? We've got a tactile adaptation, some fur for the child who's in, probably early phase 2. And we also have a bright red shiny collar on the dog to help orient the child towards having an anchor in the book to focus his visual attention from which he can search. He's got the collar, now he can find the head. Now he can find the fur, now he can find the feet. Bottom middle is a cue that a preschool classroom was using during a morning circle time for the song Head, Shoulders, Knees, and Toes. Put a little bit of red puff paint on the head, a little on the shoulders and knees and the toes, and they would point that out to him. They would either shine a flashlight on it or they would just block off the sections and open them up one at a time to be able to focus the child's attention during the song. And it made a really big difference between not being able to focus at all and suddenly being able to focus and attend to this, relatively complex 2D symbol. Communication symbols that are separate, bright colors, and visually distinct from each other, right? The bright blue and the bright yellow on this one on the bottom right are very visually distinct. I would even probably remove the red outline because the red outline actually adds to the complexity rather than reduces it. And we'll talk about that when we get to complexity in a minute. Next characteristic here is movement. Kids with CVI may need movement to attract their visual attention or to sustain it. And we saw that in the dorsal stream. If something's moving, you can see it a lot better than when it's standing still. And we immediately get attention from something that's moving if we're using our dorsal stream. Kids with CVI may only look at something that moves or has a shiny movement reflective quality to it. This also tends to help kids with CVI with mobility because when a child is moving down the hallway or moving around the classroom, the world is moving around them. So it's easier to process the moving information. I've also noticed that kids with CVI may tend to do this sort of back and forth head movement or a full body movement. And it can be easily mistaken for a sensory stim, a self-stim behavior. If you see a child with CVI doing that back and forth movement, consider that it may be that they're trying to get the world to move because when the world is static, when they're sitting still, it's not as easy to see the world or see an object in front of them. But when they're moving, they're mimicking the movement of the object. So it's really a nice compensatory method for those kids. If you see that happening, try picking up something in front of them that you might think they're interested in looking at and try moving that object instead. And what you'll notice is that the child stops. They stop doing their own head movement. And that's a sure sign that the movement was actually a compensatory method for seeing as opposed to a sensory stim behavior. Further along the range, kids with CVI don't need movement at near, but they benefit from movement at a distance to get their attention, or they benefit from movement from unfamiliar or more complex materials. So maybe movement, they can see somebody waving across the room, but if the person's not waving, then they don't see or process what's going on. Okay, so on the earlier side, right, things like pom-poms or even, mobiles that are very simple but have movement and reflective quality are going to be helpful. Okay. Third one here is visual latency. Visual latency is a visual processing delay. It's literally the length of time between when something's presented. So again, my yellow highlighter, it's moving, it's interesting, it's in my preferred visual field. I don't see it, and then suddenly I see it. I orient toward it, or look at it. It can range the amount of time of visual processing. I've seen anything up from, split second to a few seconds, all the way up towards, a long warm up time, like a child really showed limited visual behaviors until a half an hour into working with the student and showing him interesting stuff. And then he started to warm up, and then the latency went away. It's different from motor latency or cognitive latency. We're not talking about how quickly they can reach for something or how quickly they can understand what it is or respond to it. We're really just asking for the connection between when something's presented and when the child orients toward it. Further along the range, right, latency decreases with warm up, or you only see latency when the student is tired, stressed, or overstimulated. Here's a kind of perfect example of, right, the child is not looking. There's a bright orange or bright red slinky. Doesn't see it, and then sees it. And I like this picture because it shows you a very typical kind of CVI look, right? That's like maybe an early phase 2 CVI look. It's not a direct fixation, it's a regard. It's almost a looking past it or through it. And it can be subtle, and you have to try these things out several times in order to be sure that you really saw that behavior, or that it wasn't just a random movement. So we all want to kind of assume that we're seeing something. We want to try it a few times and make sure that it really is what we're seeing. Kids with CVI have visual field preferences. Now, I need to edit this slide because we used to say, field losses. And I think it's important that we don't call these losses. We talk about kids with, retinal detachment, retinal issues, scotomas, and whatnot. Those kids have field losses. Kids with CVI, or, individuals with CVI, have field preferences. And there's a distinction between the two because a preference can grow, right? With experience, the child can expand upon their preferences, whereas a loss is a loss. It's not going to recover. It's not going to grow. We're talking about field preferences. The typical progression, not always the case, but pretty much usually the case, is from lowest visual functioning phase 1 all the way up towards phase 3. First, you'll see one strong peripheral field, only seeing something in the right side, could be right or left. I don't think it has anything to do with the location of damage in the brain. I do get that question. I don't think it does. I think it has to do with experience. So in early childhood, the child had more experience on the right side and developed that preference. CVI is all about experience and exposure, right? So a strong right preference, and then, or left, and then as the child progresses, right and left, and then upper, and then central, right, or fixation, and then finally lower field. And that's really important to educational settings, because if you have difficulty with your lower visual field, you're going to have difficulty looking at things that are placed on a desk or tray in front of you. And that's why a slant board or a raised surface is almost always a good recommendation for a child with CVI. It's usually one of the go-to accommodations that should be on an IEP and should be integrated throughout the day. It's also going to impact mobility, and it's going to impact access to information in lower fields, right? So you want to be thoughtful about your positioning. Okay. So kind of a classic, bright red, shiny, interesting thing in a preferred visual field is much easier to look at. This one on the right was an interesting example of an adaptation where a child was starting to develop some strong central field skills and ability to make fixation, but this was still a new and emerging behavior, and he needed some adaptations to support it. So this child's looking at a mirror, right? And the team found something really innovative, I think, to do with that trifold board. Instead of the trifold board being in front of him, right? We usually place materials on a trifold board in front of a child to block off the complexity. When he's looking in the mirror, they put it behind him so that it blocked off the complexity behind him, and it enabled him to focus more in that central field. It's a creative solution. Okay. And I'm glad that we got to this with a little bit of time, because complexity, I think, is probably the most overarching characteristic of CVI. honestly, the more kids that I see with CVI over the years, the more I am beginning to think that complexity is really the characteristic of CVI, and that the rest of the characteristics are just explained by complexity. They're just examples of how kids with CVI manifest complexity. So I do think it's really sort of the central characteristic. You can think of this first type of complexity, which is complexity of the array, as almost like where's Waldo, right? The world is so busy, there's so much information, there's so much visual content, and it's really hard for a child with CVI to make sense of all of that visual clutter, overlapping things, and it's very hard to apply skills in navigating or visually scanning even the environment to find the important information. And we lose context of what's important, what's not. It's all just overwhelming and overstimulating. So what we're doing is we're using the other characteristics, and we're using strategies based on the other characteristics to be able to adapt for complexity. So for one child, it might be helpful to find Waldo or find a small target in a complex array by just highlighting it with a bright color. So we're just using a red circle to highlight Waldo. For one child, that might be enough. For a child in phase 3, say, that might be enough. For another child, that might not be enough, and we might have to go one step further and adapt the array to block off all of the other information. It may be that we only need to do that to preview the information. So look, here's Waldo. This is what we're looking for. We're looking for this little guy in the upper left corner with the bright red around him. So we found him here. Can you find him here now? Right? You found him here. Can you find him here in the bigger scene? And this is something that's useful in mobility, which we'll talk about in a later session intervention. This is a helpful strategy when supporting kids in orientation mobility, the act of previewing, right? Preview what it looks like in a busy scene or in a not busy scene. Now let's find it in the busy world. And you may even go one step further. Now can you find him without the red circle? Right? So these aren't permanent adaptations necessarily. They're stages in previewing and reviewing information. Complexity of the array also exists for 3D objects. Think about overlapping materials. This is Sesame Street stuffed animal toys in a basket. They are all touching each other. They're on top of each other. And for a child with CVI, it might be hard to pick out any individual toy there. But how much easier is it if you pull it out of its complex array and put it against a non-complex background? So this is a lot of what we're doing in our adaptations. We're trying to pare down the complexity of the array to make it easier. And I like this example, this picture, because what we're also seeing here is that it's not actually about size. Making something bigger isn't actually what's helpful to kids with CVI. Rather, it is reducing the complexity of the array that's helpful. So increasing size is only helpful if it serves to decrease the complexity of the array. This is one of the go-to tests that I like to do, and you can adapt this to your students, obviously, to assess the level of complexity of array that a child can deal with. Different from assessing other kinds of complexity. But for the array, I've got this little plastic goldfish toy. It's like about 1 inch long. It's a bright orange color, and it's pretty visually distinct. For another child, I used like an edible goldfish, like a goldfish snack. If the child was more interested in that than in this plastic toy. So first, can the child find this bright orange goldfish against a totally blank array? White or black background, nothing else in the way. Okay, if they can, go to the next one. Now can they find it against a more cluttered array? But notice it's a black background. There's other items around, but none of them are touching each other. And also notice that none of them are orange. They're all different colors. So the orange ones still should pop out. Some kids can't do that. Some kids can. If they can, go to the next one. Now can they do it against a more patterned array? You could also use a placemat or different patterned placemats. Notice again that the objects aren't touching each other. And also notice that the background is a contrasted background. It's mostly blue, some polka dotty colors, but there's no orange in there. So it's not like a camouflage background. If the child can do that, go one step further and put the object against a camouflage background. And I've seen kids fall off the map here at any point along this progression. You could probably expand this progression to be 10 steps if you wanted to, if you wanted a more subtle assessment. But this is a good way of starting to gauge how much complexity can this child deal with. And that's going to help you figure out what type of adaptation to make with that child. There's also complexity of target, right? So that was the array of things. Targets themselves have complexity. So in this example, the bright yellow duck is probably the least complex. The most complex is probably that little wind-up toy. And if you think about it, the child may not be able to find, the eyes on the duck necessarily, but they're going to be able to see that whole thing. And they're going to be able to make sense of it. And they're going to be able to pick it out pretty easily amongst those other ones. The little tiny wind-up toy has so many overlapping features and colors. It's going to be hard to orient it, to find the front, the back, the bottom, the top, and to make sense of what they're looking at. So targets themselves or objects have complexity. Faces also have complexity. If we had more time, we could go through each and every one of these. But I like this example because these are 12 pictures of blurred faces of celebrities. I'm sure that as you're looking at this, you're all sort of in your mind running through who these people are and you're identifying them, right? You're starting to identify who these people are. The reason that you're able to identify some of these people, if not all of them, is because complexity of faces overlaps with another characteristic, which is visual novelty or familiarity. We recognize people based on their unique individualized features. Celebrities are somewhat easier because we see them all the time, right? We're over inundated with pictures of celebrities. So the ones that we can pick out are the ones that we've seen a lot, as well as the ones that have super unique and distinct faces. Children with CVI tend to not look at unfamiliar faces as much as they do familiar faces. They may not regard or they may not make eye contact with either, and you can sort of see that progression over time. Last piece of complexity is complexity of the sensory environment. And in sensory environment, we're talking about multisensory input. That's internal input and external input. So in a child who doesn't have CVI, these kinds of factors, lighting, the noise in the room, the positioning of the child, how they're feeling. In a child without CVI, those factors all do have an impact on the child's availability for learning and their attention, but it shouldn't impact their vision, right? When we're drowsy, when we're irritated, we still process vision in a typical way. That doesn't change. For a child with CVI, it actually does. Any of these factors or others may actually serve to reduce their visual processing. So we want to be really mindful of the external environment and the factors that make kids more overstimulated, as well as the internal ones that may be reducing their visual processing. One of the most common misconceptions that I get about CVI, and that I'm sure that you've heard this said if you haven't said it yourself, is that a child with CVI has highly variable or fluctuating visual attention or visual skills. It's not the child's vision that's changing. Children with CVI don't have, constantly shifting and changing ability to use their vision or visual functioning. Rather, it's the complexity of the environment that's constantly changing, and kids' visual processing is just responding to that constantly shifting environment. So instead of pointing at the child as, the source of the change, instead look outward at the environment and think, oh, the reason why the child's not doing as well right now is because it's noisy, or because it's very bright, or because the child's in a position that's not as stable. So first look at the environment before looking at a factor related to the child's attention. Okay. Recognizing that we're sort of running out of time, I want to just speed through these last characteristics so that you have them. There's not a lot of new information about these ones except for light, right? We used to call this light gazing or non-purposeful gaze. We're now calling it need for or attraction to light, and it's important to make that distinction because kids with CVI at a lower side of visual functioning, phase 1, phase 2, do light gaze, staring at bright primary sources of light. They may also engage in this sort of, what we used to call non-purposeful gaze, which is that sort of looking past or through something or almost appearing to look at nothing at all. But we don't really use that term non-purposeful gaze anymore because non-purposeful gaze is purposeful. It serves the purpose of trying to attend to other senses. I'm looking away so that I can listen to you. It's not a sign of inattention. It's not a sign of being zoned out or not paying attention. It actually could be the opposite for a lot of our kids. It could be that things are overstimulating, so they can't deal with looking and listening at the same time, or looking and touching at the same time. So I'm separating the two, and I'm doing this behavior of looking away deliberately. And I think it's important to emphasize that so that you don't mistake that for loss of attention. Okay, light gazing, non-purposeful gaze, right? Sort of looking off or not looking at something does serve a purpose. Also consider that kids who are in Riften chairs or adapted wheelchairs that are tilted up because they have low neck or muscle tone may just be staring at lights all day because that's the position that their chair is in. If you were in that position and you had a attraction to lights, you'd probably be staring at lights all day too. So be considerate of the position that kids are faced in. Further along the range, we still see this characteristic, but we see it as light to enhance attending. So we see backlighting or using a flashlight to illuminate a visual target can be very helpful to be able to attract, elicit, or sustain their visual attention. Okay. Now, the last few, I'm literally just going to skim through. If you're able to go like another 2-3 minutes, we can make sure that we have time. Don't log off because we do need to have the, you need a link to your evaluation. But I just want to skim through these quickly to make sure that you have what they are. In the resources, we also have the more descriptions of each of these. And we'll review this more in our next session too. But difficulty with distance viewing, right? Distance being a function of complexity. We need the exit code too. Atypical visual reflexes, which we'll talk about when we talk about assessment. Difficulty with visual novelty, which we already talked about in the context of faces, but that's true of objects too. And absence of visually guided reach, which we've talked about a little bit in the context of complexity, right? So I think when we think about complexity, it has this overarching impact on absolutely everything. Okay, and what you've seen there is that the characteristics overlap. You cannot separate them out and think about them individually. You have to think about how all of them intersect and relate to the whole child. So on that note, it's exactly 2:30 or 4:30 actually. And I want to stop sharing and turn it back over to Ruth and just make sure that we have time to wrap up things. Thank you guys so much. You have access to the PowerPoint and everything too, so feel free to reach out to me as well.
Chris, do you have any time for Q&A? Does anybody have any questions for Chris?
Oh yeah, I have time. I'm putting my email address in there too. Feel free to ask questions. I'm happy to stay on for as long as you guys want.
Okay. I don't see any questions. Wait, I have a chat. Oh, no, that's you. I think right now there's no questions, but we're going to do a quick poll, everybody. No, actually, Conchita, do we have a poll, an ending poll?
We do have an ending poll. Oh, you never shared results from the first one. It's okay.
Oh,
okay. So now, and also there's a link in the chat so you can get a certificate of attendance. Okay, so there's a very short poll just trying to figure out on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your satisfaction with this webinar? 1 being not satisfied at all, 5 being great information, very satisfied. So we'll give you all a little bit of time to fill that out. It's anonymous, so don't worry about offending us or Chris.
Yeah, totally.
Actually, I can't speak for Chris. So we're getting comments in the chat that say, where are the resources that people can get?
Oh yeah. Ruth Ann, do you have the resources to share with them, or do you want me to email them to people?
Oh, that was me supposed to emailing them.
Oh, okay.
So actually, I will email them to everybody who registered. So I will be sending those out. It Says, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you much for your wonderful ideas. It was so much fun, information, ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and thank you. Yeah, so my bad on the handouts. That was totally supposed to be me and I did not do that.
Okay.
No worries.
I did send them to some people who registered today. But
Oh, awesome.
all right. And then we're going to send the PDF of the PowerPoint out as well. So thank you, everybody. And Chris, it doesn't look like there's any Q&A. So hopefully we'll all see you again on December 2nd when Chris will be back to present another topic on CVI. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. And thanks again for having me, Ruth Ann and Conchita. And you guys have, I put in my, in the chat box, my email. Please feel free to email me if there's anything else I can do to support. But thanks again so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Talk to you next time. Thanks. Bye.
Talk soon. Thanks.